A grinding screech tears through the damp air, the sound of iron wheels biting into the earth. It is the morning of the winter solstice, 190 BCE, on the plains of Magnesia, and a dense, unnatural fog has swallowed the world. Inside this white void, 54 Indian elephants scream in confusion, and the drivers of scythed chariots, vehicles designed to mow down infantry like wheat, strain their eyes, unable to see more than a few paces ahead. Antiochus the Great, the King of Kings, has assembled an army of 70,000 men from across the known world to crush the rising power of Rome. He has brought heavy cavalry clad in steel, archers from the steppes, and the dreaded phalanx of Alexander. But as the legions of Rome stand silent and invisible in the mist, the Seleucid king does not realize that his greatest weapons have already become his greatest liability. The moisture is slackening the bowstrings of his archers, and the fog is turning his chariots into blind projectiles that threaten his own lines more than the enemy. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we witness the death of the Hellenistic Age and the rise of the Roman superpower. But before a single sword was drawn, the weather itself had already chosen a victor. To understand why two massive armies collided in the fog of Magnesia, we must look at the map of the Mediterranean just 2 years prior. The world was locked in a cold war between a rising wolf and an aging gilded giant. In the west, the Roman Republic had just finished breaking the back of Carthage and humbling Macedon. Their legions were hardened, their confidence absolute. But in the east, the Seleucid Empire, the largest fragment of Alexander the Great's legacy, still held the wealth of Asia. King Antiochus III did not just rule land. He ruled history, styling himself the King of Kings and believing it was his destiny to Alexander's world. The tension was suffocating. In the Roman Senate, the air smelled of dry parchment and anxiety. The senators knew that at the court of Antiochus, amidst the heavy scent of frankincense and the rustle of silk, stood a man they feared more than the gods, Hannibal Barca. The exiled Carthaginian general, the architect of Rome's greatest nightmares, was now whispering in the king's ear, urging him to strike. While Rome was weary, driven by this counsel and his own hubris, Antiochus made the first move. He crossed the Hellespont into Greece, proclaiming himself the liberator of the Hellenic people. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Roman response was not diplomatic, it was kinetic. In 191 BCE, at the pass of Thermopylae, the very ground where Leonidas had once stood, the legion Antiochus's expeditionary force. The king's liberation crumbled in weeks, and he fled back across the Aegean Sea to his capital in Ephesus. He believed the war was effectively paused. The sea was a massive barrier, and no Roman army had ever dared to cross into Asia to fight a land war. Antiochus thought he could retreat, rebuild, and negotiate from a position of safety. But the Romans did something no Asian power expected. They began to build ships, and they looked east, not to negotiate, but to finish the job. In the Roman camp, the air was thick with the smell of medicinal herbs and the sharp tang of anxiety. The army was officially led by the consul, Lucius Cornelius Scipio, a capable man, but every soldier knew the real power lay with his younger brother, the legendary Scipio Africanus. Yet, in a twist of fate that could have shattered Roman morale, the conqueror of Africa was struck down by illness days before the battle. From his tent, the coughing of the great general was a grim rhythm against the rain. Command of the army fell not to a king, but to a pragmatist, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus. He was a man of iron discipline, unglamorous and efficient, who looked at the battlefield not as a stage for glory, but as a geometry problem to be solved. Across atmosphere the plain was entirely different. King Antiochus III did not hide in a tent. He paraded. At 52, he was the great king, the restorer of the Seleucid Empire, a man who had campaigned from India to Thrace. He wore armor chased with gold and surrounded himself with a court of sycophants who praised his genius. To him, war was theater. He saw himself as the heir to Alexander, destined to sweep aside the upstart republic from the west. He had numbers, he had elephants, and he had the terrain. But his confidence blinded him to a critical detail. While he was playing the role of a god king, Ahenobarbus, and the Pergamene king Eumenes II were meticulously studying the ground. Antiochus saw the Roman camp and smiled. He had the numbers, the ground, and the weapons. He didn't know he was standing in a trap of his own making. Antiochus did not merely bring an army to Magnesia. He brought a migration of nations. His force, numbering over 70,000 men, was a terrifying kaleidoscope of the ancient world's lethality. In the center stood the silver shields, the Argyrospides, the elite heirs of Alexander's veterans, bracing 21-foot. Sarissa pikes that created an impenetrable forest of steel. On the wings rode the cataphracts, heavy cavalry where both man and horse were, encased in scale armor, looking more like iron statues than flesh and blood. But the true horror lay in the beasts. 54 Indian elephants towering over the battlefield stamped the wet earth with a rhythm that could be felt in the chest of every Roman soldier across the line. To the legionaries, these weren't just animals. They were moving fortresses, smelling of musk and death, capable of crushing a cohort flat in seconds. Facing this Leviathan was a Roman force of barely 30,000 men. It was a David against a Goliath, but this David was made of gristle and discipline. The 4 legions, supported by Latin allies and the Pergamon cavalry of King Eumenes, looked dangerously small against the horizon, spanning Seleucid host. They stood in their checkerboard, manipular formation, a jagged line of red shields and short Spanish swords. On paper, it was a suicide mission. How does a man with a 2-foot sword get past 5 rows of pike points? How does a shield stop a charging elephant? But while Antiochus had size, he lacked cohesion. His army spoke a dozen languages. His commanders struggled to coordinate movements across a front that stretched for miles. Antiochus had 54 elephants and thousands of horsemen in armor of iron, but his deadliest weapon was placed right at the front, and that was his first mistake. The sun rose over the plain, but the world remained a gray underworld. A dense clinging fog rolled off the Hermus River, trapping the battlefield. In a suffocating twilight, where a man could barely see the comrade standing 5 paces away. For the Roman legions, drilled to operate in tight, cohesive maniples responsive to the whistle of a centurion, the lack of visibility was a hindrance. But for Antiochus, it was a strategic decapitation. His battle line stretched for miles, a complex machine that required constant visual signals to function. In the soup of the fog, flags were useless and trumpets were swallowed by the damp air. The great king was trying to conduct a symphony in the dark, and his units began to drift, isolated, and confused. Worse than the blindness was the moisture itself. The Seleucid skirmishers and charioteers relied on the composite bow, a terrifying weapon constructed of wood, horn, and sinew held together by animal glue. It was a masterpiece of tension, but it had a fatal flaw: humidity. As the damp mist seeped into the weapons, the glue softened and the sinew relaxed. When the order finally came to loose, the volleys that should have punched through Roman shields instead fluttered weakly through the heavy air, bouncing harmlessly off the legionaries' scudo with dull thuds. The Romans, gripping the rough wood of their heavy pila and the hilts of their gladi, realized the gods of the weather had disarmed their enemy. The mist blinded the king, but Eumenes II of Pergamon saw an opportunity in the gray haze, a gap in the line that shouldn't have been there. 0.5s. Antiochus signaled the advance, and the ground began to tremble. On the Seleucid left, the scythed chariots surged forward, their axle blades glinting wickedly even. In the dim light, these were machines of pure terror, designed to shear through bone and shield, breaking the enemy's nerve before impact. But facing them was Eumenes II, a SE commander who understood that fear is a weapon that can be turned. Instead of bracing for impact, he ordered his light infantry, Cretan archers, and slingers to rush forward. They did not target the armored drivers. They unleashed a hail of stones and arrows at the exposed chests of the horses. The result was immediate and catastrophic. The animals, maddened by pain and the deafening screams of the battlefield, ignored the reins. They did not crash into the Roman lines. They swerved violently, turning 180 degrees back into the advancing Seleucid ranks. The chariots became uncontrolled reapers, their scythes slicing through the legs of the Arab camel corps and the heavy cataphracts behind them. The formation disintegrated into a bloody slurry of broken wheels and trampled men. The Seleucid left wing was now a chaotic stew of panic and iron. And that was when Eumenes ordered the charge. In the center of the battlefield, the pride of the Seleucid army stood like a fortress wall. 16,000 men of the silver shields formed the phalanx, arranged in 10 massive blocks, their sarissa pikes, leveled to create an impenetrable hedge of steel points. But between these blocks, Antiochus had placed his elephants, intending them to act as mobile towers of strength. It was a fatal architectural error. As the chaos from the left flank spilled over and Roman javelins began to rain down, the beasts did not charge forward. They panicked. A maddened elephant does not distinguish friend from foe. The great beasts turned sideways, crashing into the tightly packed ranks of their own phalangites. The rigid discipline required for a phalanx to function shattered in an instant. The wall of pikes, which could hold back any frontal assault, was suddenly full of gaps. Ahenobarbus, watching with the cold eye of a tactician, saw the geometry of the battle change. He did not order his legions to push against the spears. He ordered them into the cracks. The Roman maniples surged into the intervals opened by the rampaging elephants. Once inside the reach of the 21-foot sarissas, the Macedonian style of war became a death sentence. The phalangites, encumbered by their massive pikes and lacking secondary weapons, were helpless against the short-stabbing gladi of the legionaries. The fighting turned into a claustrophobic slaughter, the air thick with the smell of crushed earth, iron, and the pungent musk of terrified elephants. The invincible center was being dismantled from the inside out. While the center crumbled, on the far right, the sun finally burned through the mist, revealing a glorious sight for the Seleucid monarch. Antiochus III, leading his heavy cataphracts in person, had shattered the Roman left wing. The Latin allies, unable to withstand the sheer tonnage of armored horses and men, buckled and broke. For a fleeting moment, Antiochus felt the spirit of Alexander possess him. He was driving the enemy before him, the wind screaming in his ears, his lance red with victory. He chased the fleeing troops all the way to the Roman camp, miles from the main battle line. In his mind, But war is not a duel. It is a mechanism, and Antiochus had just removed its most critical gear. By leading the charge himself, he had abandoned the role of general for that of a cavalry captain, while he was busy cutting down stragglers and shouting for his men to storm the Roman ramparts. He was blind to the disaster unfolding behind him. He did not see Eumenes turning the flank. He did not see the silver shields dying in the crush of their own formation. He was winning a skirmish while losing an empire. At the Roman camp, the tribune Marcus Aemilius Lepidus rallied the camp, guards a desperate last stand that finally halted the king's momentum. It was only then, as the adrenaline faded and the horses blew froth from their nostrils, that Antiochus looked back. The roar of his own victorious charge died away, replaced by a strange, hollow silence from the main plain. Then came the sound, not the cheer of a conquering host, but the low, agonizing wail of an army being butchered. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had spent the decisive hour of the century looting a camp, while his dynasty burned. By the time Antiochus turned his horse around, there was no army left to command. The sun set on a landscape that no longer resembled a battlefield, but a charnel house. With their formation shattered and their king fled, the surviving Seleucid infantry were trapped against the banks of the Phrygian River. The Roman cavalry, led by Eumenes, did not offer quarter. They executed a methodical annihilation. The Sarissa, once the tool of world conquest, became a heavy, useless burden in the mud as legionaries cut down men who could neither fight back nor run. Ancient historians like Livy and Appian claim that over 50,000 Seleucid soldiers fell that day, while Roman losses were counted in the low hundreds. Even if these numbers are the exaggerations of victors, the scale of the disaster is undeniable. The river ran red, choked with the bodies of men and elephants, a gruesome testament to the total collapse of the Hellenistic way of war. The peace that followed was as brutal as the slaughter. In 188 BCE, at the city of Apamea, Rome dictated terms that stripped the Seleucid Empire to the bone. Antiochus was forced to pay an indemnity of 15,000 talents of silver, a sum so vast it crippled the royal treasury for a generation. He was ordered to surrender all his war elephants and burn his navy, reducing a superpower to a landlocked regional kingdom. Most devastating of all, he had to abandon every foot of land west of the Taurus Mountains. In a single afternoon, the map of the ancient world was redrawn. Rome had not just won a battle, they had effectively evicted the successors of Alexander from Europe forever. The Battle of Magnesia was not merely a military defeat, it was a funeral for the age of Alexander. When the sun rose the next morning, the geopolitical axis of the world had shifted irrevocably from the east to the west. The Seleucid Empire, once the titan of Asia, never recovered. It fractured into a series of petty squabbles and civil wars, slowly decaying until the Roman general Pompey would arrive decades later to sweep its remnants into the dustbin of history. But the true casualty of Magnesia was the Macedonian Phalanx itself. For 2 centuries, the Sarissa had ruled the battlefield, an unstoppable wall of pike points. Magnesia proved that this rigid, lumbering formation was obsolete. The Roman legion, with its flexible maniples and initiative-driven centurions, had exposed the fatal flaw of the phalanx. If you can break its formation, you break its soul. For Hannibal Barca, the tragedy was personal. The great Carthaginian, who had spent his life trying to break Rome, watched his last hope dissolve in the fog of a Turkish plain. He fled the Seleucid court, hunted by vengeful Roman agents across the Mediterranean, until he finally took poison in a fortress in Bithynia, choosing death over chains. His passing marked the end of the old world's resistance. From the Pillars of Hercules to the sands of Syria, there was now only one law, one currency, and one master. The Mediterranean had become Mare Nostrum, our sea. The legion had proven that flexibility conquers rigidity and pragmatic discipline outlasts gilded ambition. The scream of the dying elephants at Magnesia was the birth cry of the Roman Empire, a superpower that would not face a peer rival again for another 600 years. If you want to walk the path of history's greatest turning points, from the mud of the battlefield to the marble of the Senate, please subscribe to our channel to relive heroic chapters of history with us. The story of Rome is far from over.